Some of the most well-known developers for the PlayStation today got their start making 3D platformers. Now, this is a genre that saw its peak a long time ago at this point. There are still some truly great indie efforts here and there, and I've really enjoyed a lot of those. And then there's a very rare attempt at a big budget revival of the genre every now and then, but for the most part we get very little, and the developers have moved on to making what many consider to be bigger and better things. Today, we're looking at Jak and Daxter, the second big franchise from Naughty Dog, the developer now known for making The Last of Us. High off the success of the Crash series on the PS1, Jak and Daxter was the beginning of an entirely new series of games for an entirely new era of PlayStation. Probably the first thing you'll notice playing Jak and Daxter today is that it very much has that sort of snarky attitude that was incredibly popular in the early 2000s. Thankfully, it doesn't lean too much into it, at least if you're willing to overlook its more egregious examples. It remains a very lighthearted platformer at its core, which of course was something that would quickly change in its later sequels. But here, that old school sensibility is still very much the core of the whole endeavor. It's aiming to be a fun 3D platformer first, and a sort of snarky period piece second. Still, the snark did manage to get on my nerves at times, especially when it comes to Daxter's constant blabbering, which very occasionally can be helpful, but more often than not, he's telling you something you already knew, or making an incredibly cringeworthy joke, which weirdly does kind of fit his annoying personality in a way that works well enough for me to handwave the whole thing. You can definitely feel that this game was made by the same people who made Crash Bandicoot in some ways, especially when it comes to the incredibly familiar spin attack, but it's also fundamentally different from the extremely linear Crash games. In fact, one of the most exciting things that this game does is that it doesn't delineate between the worlds, essentially the game's different levels. You're not hitting a level select or jumping into paintings or portals like you may have done in the previous generation. Instead, every level is contained within a single boundless world, where everything is linked together. And in the majority of cases, you can simply transition between the levels by walking over an invisible boundary. That being said, while the generational leap brought plenty of new tech and advantages with it, in Jak and Daxter you can also feel the hallmarks of early PS2 games oozing out of every pore. The camera isn't particularly great, but it is somewhat better than most PS1 games. Another thing that takes quite a while to get used to is the double jump, which requires you to time it for the top of your first jump. It takes quite a while to get down, and even when I got to a point where I was doing it pretty reliably, there would be times I'd fail to do it at very inopportune moments. Beyond that, however, the game mostly just plays like you'd expect a 3D platformer to. There's not a lot to say about it, and it still feels pretty good today, accepting the earlier caveats. Most of the game's combat will see you engaging with low-grade stooges scattered throughout the world that are annoyances more than anything else, which is not too unusual for a 3D platformer. But there is also some really neat boss design, which makes it kind of a shame there's only a few of them in the entire game. They're very interesting and unique, especially compared to the sort of boss fights you'd expect in your standard 3D platformer at the time. Don't get me wrong, these are still multi-stage bosses that generally follow the good old rule of three, but they're also both sort of puzzles in their own right, which adds a whole other unexpectedly great layer to them. Of course, if I'm being honest with myself, I'm not really here for the combat. I'm here to gather up as much junk as I possibly can. These 3D platformers always engage the part of my brain that just wants to collect everything, run into every little corner, and find every little secret. And thankfully, while Jak and Daxter is a tiny bit of a collectathon, it's only to the extent a lot of other games like it are. It isn't too obnoxious at all, especially by the standards of the time. The ultimate goal is always getting the number of power cells you need in order to get to the next section of the game. You can get those by just picking them up in the world or completing little side quests for people standing around. You can choose to be a completionist about the other stuff, but it's nowhere near as crucial. Though you can trade a certain number of precursor orbs for power cells many times over throughout. Even the cells themselves, if you've been going for 100%, you'll have more than enough of them by the time you get to the final hub to beat the game. So there's no real need to go for the full 100% if you don't want to. Especially because the secret ending you get by collecting everything in the game is extremely not worth the effort. That being said, I found many of the challenges required to get the cells worth at least checking out, and so ended up with a ton of them, if not quite all of them. This is where I'd usually talk about the best way to play a lot of the retro games that I look at. And it's also where Jak and Daxter gets really interesting. You've probably been watching this footage and thinking this is probably emulated, but what I'm actually doing is a really impressive project on the PC called OpenGoal. This project is aiming to decompile the original Jak game code, developing their own compiler and recompiling the decompiled code for modern x86 64 processors. What this means is that when you play the game in OpenGoal, you are actually playing a native version of the game that has been built for modern systems. Yes, there are definitely some weird little quirks of this, especially around aspects of the game that were built for a 4:3 aspect ratio, like some of the things in the menus. But for the most part, I wholeheartedly recommend this as pretty much the go-to way to play Jak and Daxter. I ran into absolutely zero major issues in my entire playthrough, and it adds some nice quality of life features like subtitles and highlighted precursor orbs, both of which are greatly appreciated. And I do very much think Jak and Daxter is still worth playing today. Granted, some parts of it do feel very dated, there's no doubt about that. It was a game right on the edge of the transition between the PS1 era and the PS2 era, and it does show, both mechanically and narratively. But it absolutely still stands out as a fantastic example of what a 3D platformer can be, with a perfect balance between collectibles, combat, and platforming puzzles that make it as much fun to play now as it was over 20 years ago.